This is part 2 about the historic Henry and Christina Gehl brick farmhouse, which takes a closer look at what the property and house look like in 2022. Part 1 introduced Henry and Christina, showed the changes to their farm over the years, and followed the ownership progression as it became a Minnesota Century farm. 8 pictures showed how the property appeared in 2009. To refresh, let's look at each of these pictures again. This is the road into the farmhouse location, showing the Minnesota River and its valley. The Minnesota River is fairly wide here, and the site is prone to flooding. The farmhouse was built right on the riverbank, although it is more elevated than a person would think. Despite being unoccupied for a number of years, the house appeared in great shape. This was a huge house for its time. There were 5 windows across the second level. The farmhouse featured an L with covered porches on the east and west sides. Have you ever seen such a fancy brick outhouse before? The house was likely built of Carver brick and had a fieldstone foundation. That was 2009. Now, let's jump forward to 2022. Here's a 2019 satellite image of the farm and house location, which is now owned by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as part of the Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge. A blacktop road was built from the top of the bluffs to the lower elevations below. The view from the top of the bluffs is outstanding. Although, when this video was shot in May, there were no leaves on the trees. The Fish and Wildlife Service built a large building on the site. This building is an education and visitor center, which is open to the public. This photograph shows the visitor center from below. The Fish and Wildlife Service has numerous trails throughout the property. This portion of the trail was also paved, which goes from the visitor center to the barn location below, and the farmhouse on the banks of the Minnesota River. We already spoke about the large elevation changes on the property. The elevation on top of the bluffs is about 835 feet, while the elevation of the farmhouse is around 720 feet. The visitor center is located on a prominent spot overlooking the house and barn. The area is heavily wooded with a large number of tall oak trees. Walking down the looping path, you see the remaining foundation of the barn, which has been fenced off. The house needs no introduction. Turning the corner, you are now on the level with the house and barn. It is a tranquil spot with the sounds of nature all around you. Further down the paved path, you come across the remnants of the barn. This area has been fenced off to prevent people from getting too close to the fragile fieldstone walls. The Fish and Wildlife Service erected several signs to explain the history of the site. On one of the signs is a photo of the barn. The Carver County Historical Society supplied this photo, which was taken during the winter. The main portion of the barn was built in 1884, but other segments were added later. The barn was built of wood, while the foundation was built of fieldstone. Multiple windows were built into the fieldstone foundation. This one segment of the foundation is easily recognized in the fieldstone remnants today. Yes, concrete block was probably added at some point to help stabilize this portion of the foundation. If you look closely, bricks were used in places too. You can walk into the lowest level of the barn and imagine how it used to look. Think about how long it would have taken to gather and haul all the rocks. Although the barn must have been an impressive structure at one time, the brick farmhouse is definitely the gem of the site. The 2.5-story farmhouse was likely made of cream-colored Carver brick. It featured the main house, an L, 2 covered porches on either side, and a nearby outhouse. From the paved path, the first view of the house is from the west side. Despite its age, the house still looks very elegant and has some fancy brickwork. The chimney on the right side looks original and features an interesting tiered design. The attic window had a fancy arch around its top, while the sill itself was likely constructed of Kasota stone, which had the same cream color as Carver brick. The first and second story windows all featured the same design, adding to the elegance of the structure. As you approach the house from the west, it seemingly becomes much larger, and you can feel history all around you. Here is a perspective from the southwest. This is a closer view of the brick detail on the house. Here is the covered porch on the west side of the L. The bay window is likely an addition to the house at a later date. Moving to the south side of the house, the poor condition of the roof is quite evident. Field stone were used in the basement foundation of the house. This video shows how close the Minnesota River is to the east side of the house. Finally, this perspective gives a better idea how high the house location is, despite it being right next to the riverbank. The east side of the house is a little difficult to photograph without stepping into the river. This shot looks to the southwest, showing the east side covered porch, which has been boarded up. There was an outside entrance to the basement, covered up by double doors. As you can see, there are no cracks visible in any of the outer walls. Finally, let's look at the north side of the house. This perspective shows the north side of the L and the 2 covered porches. The north side of the house also featured a small attic window. The outhouse, off the northeast side of the house, was also fancy. The cloth hanging from the roof was added by the Fish and Wildlife Service as protection from water damage, but its usefulness ended years ago. As mentioned before, the outhouse was built right into the riverbank. Coming down the path, from the house to the outhouse, you can see the door and a side window. Although somewhat boarded up, you can also see the fancy brickwork around the two outhouse windows. This is a closer look at the north-facing window. This last clip shows how close the back of the outhouse was to the river. As you may have noticed, there is a barbed wire fence around the house now. This is to protect the house as well as any visitors. Floodwaters have only touched the main floor joists twice, and the walls show no structural issues. However, the roof has not been repaired, which makes its reuse nearly impossible now. I hope you enjoyed this video about the historic Gehl farmhouse. That concludes the video. Please check out my websites at mnbricks.com and chaskabrick.com.